or our scripture reading, is from Acts 8, verse 4. Acts 8, verse 4. It says, those who had been scattered preached the word wherever they went. Yeah, short and sweet. Just like all my sermons. All right. So the book of Acts is filled with sermons, both to Jews and to Gentiles, the way those reading or hearing Acts would have understood the world, Jew, Gentile. A number of these sermons are recorded in their entirety. And actually one such narrative is Stephen's sermon recorded in Acts chapter 7, right before the verses in Acts chapter 8. Tensions were high between traditional Jews and followers of Christ. Stephen's accused blasphemy and subsequent stoning pushed those tensions over the edge. The followers of Christ at Jerusalem scattered as Saul began persecution in earnest. As they went fleeing, they didn't forget why they were being persecuted in the first place. They continued speaking and sharing their faith, some maybe even doing it for the first time. And so Acts chapter 8, right after that, is where we meet Philip. Technically, he's shown up before this in Acts chapter 6. Philip was actually one of the 7, sometimes called deacons, put in charge of the daily food distribution to Greek widows. Another of those 7 was actually Stephen, who we mentioned before, though their main role was to oversee and to wait on that particular group of people. That wasn't the only thing that they did. In fact, Stephen was seized mainly because of his eloquence and the miracles he performed through the power of the Holy Spirit. His service was more than just waiting tables. And we see that with Philip too. Later in Acts 21, he's called Philip the evangelist. He does more than what we see the traditional deacon role today as. But back to Acts 8. As one who was scattered by persecution, Philip made his way to Samaria. He preached the gospel, he performed miracles, and he baptized believers. He was, by any of today's metrics, successful. Oh, it got really quiet. Philip's mission probably wasn't as simple as the few verses after Acts 8:4 make it seem. If you've read any of Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, you may have picked up on the fact that Jews and Samaritans hated each other. Just for a few examples, in Luke 9:51-56, a village in Samaria didn't welcome Jesus and company because they knew he was on his way to Jerusalem. James and John proposed calling down fire to destroy the village as punishment. Jesus chastises them. And then in the next chapter, Luke chapter 10, Jesus tells the parable of the Good Samaritan. In there, he not only calls this enemy of the Jews good, but he also makes him the hero of the story, one who offered help to a Jewish man that his own people had left for dead. In Luke 17, Jesus heals 10 lepers, and the only one who returns to thank Jesus is a Samaritan. And finally, in John 4, verses 1-42, Jesus talks with a Samaritan, who's also a woman, and a disgraced woman at that. However, many of her neighbors believed because of her testimony. So I want to focus on that last story a little bit, the one at the well, as a launching point. Let's unpack a little of what was said and give some context here. So, Jews and Samaritans hated each other. But how far back? For how long? Well, give or take 1,000 years or so. But why? Well, history in a nutshell. Okay, the woman mentions in John 4:12, our father, Jacob, implying shared ancestry, father meaning ancestry here, of her and Jesus, who is a Jewish man. So all the way back in 1 Kings 12, Israel rejects Rehoboam, Solomon's son, as their leader. To be fair, Rehoboam didn't listen to wise counsel and told the people he was going to be a harsh king, so, Rehoboam kept 2 of the 12 tribes of Israel, specifically Judah and Benjamin, which would be called Judah, or the southern kingdom. And Jeroboam, a rebel, ended up ruling the other 10, which were called Israel, or the northern kingdom. Basically, after that, Israel and Judah were at war with each other until Israel was conquered. So wait, what? Why am I telling you this? Well, Samaritans were descendants of those left in Israel after it was conquered. They specifically traced their ancestry to the tribes of Manasseh, Ephraim, and Levi. In other words, they were Northern Kingdom Jews. In fact, Samaria was a major city in the Northern Kingdom. But it doesn't stop there. Samaritans developed a unique identity. After Judah was conquered, sent into exile, and returned, the Samaritans offered to help rebuild the temple, so important to both groups' identities, and the Jews refused their help. So, Samaritans then, believing that Mount Gerizim was the true Mount of Blessing, not the one in Jerusalem, built their own temple. They also rejected many writings, paring down their canon to the first 5 books of Moses, or the Pentateuch. And the fighting begins again. So the Jews didn't like the temple that the Samaritans had built, so they burned it down 200 years later. And then they commemorated that day with a holiday, on which it's forbidden to mourn. So, and of course I glossed over all of the wars and the fighting, so check out all of Kings and Chronicles if you're interested in that history. So then back to the woman at the well. In John 4:20, when the woman asks Jesus about worshiping on this mountain or in Jerusalem, she's directly referencing that temple that was burned by Jesus' countrymen. I mean, yeesh, right? So in this very, very, very small nutshell is what Philip was walking into. Tensions are probably high. So what does Philip say? Well, it must have been enthralling because no one wrote it down. So I want us to do an exercise. So I want us to get into small groups. I don't know how many, however many you think, small groups of people. And keeping all of this in mind, which I have summarized here, which I'll give to each group, what would be some key things, if you were Philip, that you would want to talk about to the Samaritans?
Every single disciple this time when it went to a different area, they told a personal testimony, which is something that is one of the most powerful things that you can give, is a personal testimony of, this is how I came to Christ, this is how I know him, this is what he's done for me.
I am assuming that Philip was telling the story, and that maybe was his personal story, and that might have been the story of Jesus. Everything that happened in Jerusalem, obviously, some of them might have been in Jerusalem, maybe, and heard parts of it, and who knows? But just telling the story and then showing in the scripture where this what happened and this has been written by the prophet.
But remember, they only held to the Pentateuch, so they rejected the prophets.
That's true.
So that one, but there are places in the Pentateuch that talk about Jesus.
But I mean, if he brings up like the things that they don't believe and saying, well, this is what Jesus actually did, I think it would be valid for him to talk about it.
So
But yeah, having 5 books and having the sacrificial, I don't know how the Samaritans did they sacrifice or not. They probably did.
they had a temple, so.
The only difference is that the Jews they had it very strict. They had all those certain ceremonies and so on and so forth.
And so in our group, we talked about looking for points of agreement, such as Abraham, our father, all the way back to there, and then here's the fulfillment of the Messiah and Jesus.
Maybe sorcery against real miracles.
Yeah. Does he heal?
Okay. Because right after that, he does have the encounter with Simon, the sorcerer. So that's pretty shortly after.
It kind of goes along with like the personal story and testimony, but I think it probably would be important to highlight like the way that Christ interacts with people, with other people, is like radically different than the way that other Jews of his time interacted with people of other races. I feel like that would be really important.
Relating their pop culture, or whatever you wanna call it, to how Christ actually did life and tying it in with the gospel.
How he Philip interact, not just with races, but also with people from other social background and cultural background. No?
So we can say groups is race,
Right, exactly.
social status,
Economic status.
right, social, right. So we can think about this even today, right? Because we also live in a fairly tense environment. There are factions all around us, maybe not as obvious as Jews and Samaritans, maybe some are, but if we look at this list that we've made, we can think about some of this, and it's probably a lot of it's still applicable today. Maybe some of it's not as specific as what we see, maybe if we generalized it more. Maybe some things could be removed, possibly, but that's what we want to think about, right? Because Philip had a similar mission to what we have, right? Jesus had gone before him and made a way with the woman at the well, and he does the same for us into different divisive situations. And we shouldn't and can't go in without knowing what God has done already. So my challenge to you today, and to myself, is to look for these ways around the barriers, just like Philip did. Whether it's cultural, whether it's social, economic, political, whatever it may be. Let's build bridges. Let's pray on how to communicate and for God to show us the doors he's already opened, like he did with Jesus with the woman at the well.